All right, we are live, and today we are doing something different. I'm really curious about this. What have the philosophers said about the importance of traveling? Let's see. Philosophers across various traditions have reflected on the significance of travel, often linking it to personal growth, understanding, and the pursuit of wisdom. Here's a rundown of some key perspectives. Socrates, though not a traveler himself, emphasized questioning and examining one's life. Travel, in his view, could be a means to broaden one's horizons and challenge assumptions, aligning with his famous dictum: "The unexamined life is not worth living." Exposure to different cultures and ideas through travel could serve as a practical extension of his method of inquiry. Plato, in his dialogues, particularly the Republic, saw value in learning from diverse experiences. He suggested that philosophers should ascend from the cave of ignorance to the light of truth, a metaphorical journey. Plato, in his dialogues, particularly the Republic, saw value in learning from diverse experiences. He suggested that philosophers should ascend from the cave of ignorance to the light of truth, a metaphorical journey. Physical travel could mirror this, offering encounters with new perspectives that refine one's understanding of justice, beauty, and the good. The Stoics, like Seneca, had a more nuanced take. Seneca wrote in his letters to Lucilius that travel alone doesn't cure a restless mind. You must change the mind, not the climate. The Stoics, like Seneca, had a more nuanced take. Seneca wrote in his letters to Lucilius that travel alone doesn't cure a restless mind. You must change the mind, not the climate. Yet he acknowledged that it could inspire reflection and detachment from material comforts, aligning with Stoic ideals of self mastery and resilience. Marcus Aurelius, another Stoic, implied that understanding human nature possible through observing different peoples strengthens one's equanimity. Equ- equanimity. Montaigne, a Renaissance thinker, was more enthusiastic. In his essays, he praised travel as a way to rub against other minds and customs, arguing it combats provincialism and fosters humility. He wrote, "Traveling through the world produces a marvelous clarity in the judgment of man. I know no better school for forming one's life." Montaigne. Montaigne. Montaigne means mountain. A Renaissance thinker was more enthusiastic. In his essays, he praised travel as a way to rub against other minds and customs, arguing it combats provincialism and fosters humility. He wrote, "Traveling through the world produces a marvelous clarity in the judgment of men. I know no better school for forming one's life." Immanuel Kant, though he never left Königsberg, speculated on travel's intellectual benefits. In his critique, that's kind of weird. That's weird when philosophers like he has never traveled, but then he thinks that travel is the best thing you should be doing. In his critique of judgment, he tied aesthetic appreciation to encountering the sublime, something travel often provides through nature or grand human works. He also believed exposure to diverse peoples could refine moral reasoning, supporting his categorical imperative by revealing universal human traits. Existentialists like Jean Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir saw travel as a way to confront freedom and authenticity. Sartre's experiences in places like Nazi occupied France shaped his views on responsibility, while the Beauvoir's travel, Beauvoir, beautiful view, beautiful eyes, beautiful sight, maybe. Beauvoir travels informed her feminist and ethical writings. For them, travel strips away the familiar, forcing one to define oneself anew. Finally, Lao Tzu, from the Taoist tradition, viewed wandering as a natural state. In the Tao Te Ching, he suggests that moving without fixed purpose aligns with the Tao, fostering harmony and spontaneity. Travel in this sense becomes a way to unlearn rigidity and flow with life's currents. In short, philosophers often frame travel as a tool for self discovery, intellectual expansion, and moral development, though some caution it's no panacea unless paired with introspection. Each saw it through their own lens, but the consensus leans toward its power to shake up complacency and enrich understanding. This is very interesting. So interesting. What do present day philosophers, present day alive philosophers say about traveling? Hmm. Lao Tzu from the Taoist tradition viewed wandering as a natural state. In the Tao Te Ching, he suggests that moving without fixed purpose aligns with the Tao, fostering harmony and spontaneity. Contemporary philosophers who are still alive have offered varied perspectives on travel, often tying it to broader themes like identity, ethics, globalization, and the human condition. While there isn't a unified philosophy of travel among them, their ideas reflect how travel intersects with modern life. Here's a look at some notable living thinkers and their relevant insights. Peter Singer, the Australian utilitarian ethicist, doesn't focus directly on travel but addresses its implications through his work on global ethics and climate change. In books like The Life You Can Save and Ethics in the Real World, he critiques the environmental cost of frequent travel, especially air travel, which contributes heavily to carbon emissions. For Singer, the pleasure. This is interesting. This. I was literally just thinking about this. That's true. There is a climate impact to it. So that means we need to solve that problem. That doesn't mean that we keep people in the boxes, because traveling makes people better. The more people travel, the more the mind opens up, the more they have humility, the more they start thinking outside the box, the more they think that, hey, it's not me, you, like you and me are not different. We are literally humans with programming that we grew up, and now we all are trying to fix ourselves. And yeah, like traveling is really important. Like some of the biggest religious leaders, what they used to do was basically travel. Yeah, some used to just walk around, which is hard, but they are constantly traveling, because they are not only learning, interacting with people, learning about their culture, but also spreading their message. So traveling is really important. So we shouldn't be talking about reducing travel because of climate impact. We should be actually figuring out how we should actually understand how travel is so much important in breaking all the barriers and bringing peace for this world. And like literally over here, now we are kind of getting into politics, but in Vancouver, I have friends who are Ukrainian, friends who are Russian, and they are hanging out together and they love each other. They try to not talk about the politics, but they hang out together. They are having a good time in this totally new world. But on the other side of the world, something different is happening. The story is different. So yeah, we basically need to break the barrier. So basically, this should actually really motivate. So like we have covered airco in one of the previous streams, where airco is using the is basically doing carbon sequestration, capturing carbon from the air, and then converting that into jet aviation fuel. So we need more of these methods. So we need to look at everything from a technology perspective now: how to scale things, how to improve things, how to use all this power with AI that we have to make things better, not try to stop air travel. We should actually have more travel, and maybe even make things easier. Like today, if I want to travel from one side of the world to the other side, it would take me, if it most probably there's no direct flight, so it would take me like 30 hours or at least a day to travel. How do we bring that down to 5 hours or something like that? That should be the technological challenge. Yeah. Peter Singer, Australian utilitarian ethicist, doesn't focus directly on travel but addresses its implications through his work on global ethics and climate change. In books like The Life You Can Save and Ethics in the Real World, he critiques the environmental cost of frequent travel, especially air travel, which contributes heavily to carbon emissions. For Singer, the pleasure or enrichment of travel must be For Singer, the pleasure or enrichment of travel must be weighed against its harm to the planet, a classic utilitarian calculus. He would likely argue that travel for superficial reasons, say Instagram bragging rights, is hard to justify when it exacerbates suffering elsewhere. That's interesting. Like, I somewhere also think, like, even though people might be traveling for Instagram reasons, still there would be some moments, because they are not in a rut, there would be some moments that would change the way how they are, change the way how they are thinking. It's still, even though they are traveling for Instagram, it's like going to gym because you want aesthetics. So even though you are going for the aesthetics, still you are actually making your body healthier, unless you're doing just focus on aesthetics and using drugs and stuff. But anyways, but that's interesting. I'm guessing, like, even though people who go for Instagram bragging rights, they might still find some moments that would totally change the way they think, and it would still, yeah. I mean, traveling for me, even though I post pictures on Instagram, I love photography, I love clicking beautiful pictures, I love aesthetics. So I do post my pictures on Instagram, but all those travels have also changed me somehow, and I would be a different person if I wouldn't have those experiences. Alain de Botton, a Swiss British philosopher, explicitly explores travel in The Art of Travel 2002. He argues that travel's value lies not in the act itself, but in how it reshapes our perceptions. Drawing from thinkers like Ruskin and Baudelaire, he suggests we often travel with unrealistic expectations, seeking escape or transformation, only to find our inner discontent follows us. Seeking escape or transformation, and that's important, that's really important. Like, when you travel, especially, this has happened with so many people who travel to Paris, right? You think that, oh wow, my dream was always to look at the Eiffel Tower, and then one day when one day you fly to Paris, you walk up to the Eiffel Tower, you look at it for 5 seconds, and then you're like, what now? What do I do now? My entire life's goal was to, my dream was to one day look at the Eiffel Tower, click a picture with it, and now that I've looked at it, what do I do with it now? And that is very interesting, because once you do that, once you once you figure out, only to find our inner discontent follows us. That is the transformation, because that transforms you from finding solution outside you to turning inwards and now working inwards. For Deboton, the real payoff comes from mindful observation. Noticing details in a new place can spark curiosity and self awareness. He's skeptical of travel as a cure all, but sees it as a lens to examine our lives. He's skeptical of travel as a cure all, but sees it as a lens to examine our lives. Kwame Anthony Appiah, a British Ghanaian philosopher, ties travel to cosmopolitanism in works like Cosmopolitanism, Ethics in a World of Strangers. He views travel as a practical encounter with the other, breaking down cultural silos. Appiah argues that engaging with different ways of life through conversation of shared experiences fosters a moral obligation to recognize universal humanity while respecting differences. Travel for him isn't just tourism, it's a testing ground for ethical coexistence in a globalized world. Ethical coexistence in the globalized world. This is something that people talk about in Europe, where in general, Europe is a travel destination. Bunch of young people go over there, and sometimes they are not very respectful for to the local cultures, and that's true. We need to make sure that there's an ethical coexistence in a globalized world. Apaya argues that engaging with different ways of life through conversation or shared experiences fosters a moral obligation to recognize universal humanity while respecting differences. Travel for him isn't just tourism, it's a testing ground for ethical coexistence in a globalized world. Martha Nussbaum, an American philosopher, connects travel to her capabilities approach. Wow. Martha Nussbaum, an American philosopher, connects travel to her capabilities approach and the cultivation of empathy. In Not for Profit 2010 and Cultivating Humanity 97, she emphasizes how exposure to diverse cultures, often through travel, enhances our imaginative capacity to understand others' lives. She will likely see travel as a way to develop what she calls narrative imagination, a key to justice and democratic citizenship. But she would caution against shallow travel that treats cultures as mere spectacles rather than lived realities. Connects travel to her capabilities approach and the cultivation of empathy. In Not for Profit and Cultivating Humanity, she emphasizes how exposure to diverse cultures, often through travel, enhances our imaginative capacity to understand others' lives. She would likely see travel as a way to develop what she calls narrative imagination, a key to justice and democratic citizenship. But she would caution against shallow travel that treats cultures as mere spectacles rather than lived realities. Slavoj Zizek, the Slovenian provocateur, doesn't address travel head on but critiques the ideologies behind it in works like Living in the End Times. He might see modern travel, especially mass tourism, as a symptom of late capitalism, a commodified escape that promises authenticity but delivers standardized experiences. Think Airbnb or resort chains. Hmm. A commodified escape that promises authenticity but delivers standardized experiences. Think Airbnb or resort chains. Zizek could argue that travel today about often reinforces rather than challenges our illusions of freedom as we chase exotic thrills while ignoring the global systems making them possible. Labor inequality. Our illusions of freedom as we chase exotic thrills while ignoring the global systems, labor inequality making them possible. Emily Thomas, a British philosopher, is one of the few to tackle travel philosophically in depth with the meaning of travel. She sees travel as an encounter with the unfamiliar, echoing historical thinkers like Bacon and Hume. For Thomas, it's not just about physical movement, but about confronting the otherness, new ideas, landscapes, or people. She explores how travel has shaped philosophy, Locke's fascination with travelogues, and raises practical questions. Is it ethical to visit doomed tourism sites like melting glaciers? She champions travel's potential to expand our minds but warns of its pitfalls like cultural voyeurism. Hmm. These philosophers don't agree on travel's worth. Singer might clash with Thomas on its ethics, while Zizek might scoff at de Botton's optimism. De Botton, Botton. Travel's value lies not in the act itself, but how it reshapes our perceptions. Drawing from thinkers like Ruskin, he suggests we often travel with unrealistic expectations, seeking escape or transformation, only to find our inner discontent follows us. The real payoff comes from mindful observation. Noticing details in a new place can spark curiosity and self awareness. He's skeptical of travel as a cure all but sees it as a lens to examine our lives. These all make sense. I'm just not sure about what Emily is talking about with cultural voyeurism. Tell me more. Dives deep into the dual nature of travel, its capacity to enrich our understanding and its risk of sliding into superficiality or exploitation. When she champions travel's potential to expand our mind, she's pointing to its ability to jolt us out of our everyday assumptions. Encountering unfamiliar landscapes, people, or ways of life can stretch our intellectual and emotional horizons. Think of it as a real world version of philosophy's thought experiments. Instead of imagining a trolley problem, you are navigating a market in Marrakesh or a Joh in Norway, forced to grapple with perspectives you had never otherwise considered. She draws on historical examples like John Locke poring over travelogues to fuel his empiricism to show how travel has long been a catalyst for big ideas. But the flip side, where she warns of pitfalls like cultural voyeurism, is where her argument gets sharp. Cultural voyeurism for Thomas is when travel becomes less about genuine engagement and more about gawking at the exotic for personal thrills or social clout. It's the tourist snapping selfies with locals as if they are props or treating a sacred site like a theme park. Think influencers posing at Bali's temples without grasping their meaning. This isn't just shallow, it risks reducing living cultures to museum exhibits, stripping them of agency and context. Thomas sees it as a failure to travel philosophically, where the point is mutual understanding, not just ticking boxes on a bucket list. She ties this to the broader ethical questions. For instance, she asks whether it's right to visit places purely to witness their decline, like when is sinking. Hmm. It's right to visit places purely to witness their decline, like when is sinking or Arctic ice melting, without reflecting on our role in those crises. Travel can expand the mind, sure, but if it's just voyeurism, consuming difference without responsibility, it's a hollow exercise. Thomas wants us to approach travel with curiosity and humility, not as spectators peering through a one-way glass. Hmm. I think this is the most, uh, let's say, holistic view, which looks at both the positive and the negative side. Her stance echoes Montaigne's old praise of travel as a school for life, but with modern twist. In a globalized, Instagram driven world, the line between enrichment and exploitation is razor thin. She's not saying don't travel, she's saying to do it with eyes open, not just for the gram. Does that tension between growth and voyeurism ring true? Let's see, John Locke. Tell me more. John Locke pouring out travelogues to fuel his empiricism. Emily Thomas highlights John Locke's engagement with travelogues as a prime example for how travel, or at least its vivid second-hand accounts, has historically sparked philosophical breakthroughs. Locke, a 17th century English thinker and a cornerstone of empiricism, didn't roam the world himself. He was a bit of a homebody, sticking mostly to England and a brief stint in France. But his mind traveled far through the pages of travel narratives, detailed reports from explorers, merchants, and missionaries about distant lands, peoples, and customs. For Locke, these weren't just adventure stories, they were raw data feeding his revolutionary idea that knowledge comes from experience, not innate ideas. They were raw data feeding his revolutionary idea that knowledge comes from experience, not innate ideas. Locke's empiricism, laid out in an essay concerning human understanding, argues that we are born as blank slates, tabula rasa, and everything we know is built from sensory input and reflection. Travelogues were a gold mine for this. They gave him accounts of wildly different cultures, how the indigenous people of the Americas organized societies, how East Asian rituals diverged from European norms, or how Pacific islanders navigated vast oceans. This diversity fascinated him. If humans everywhere shared innate ideas as his rivals, the rationalists, claimed, why did beliefs and practices vary so drastically? For Locke, these differences supported his view that the mind is shaped by its environment, by what it encounters and processes. Take his interest in language, a key plank of his philosophy. Travelogue showed him how vocabularies and concepts differed across cultures. Some lacked words for abstract notions like justice that European took for granted, yet thrived with their own systems. This bolstered his argument that ideas aren't universal or God given, they are constructed from living experience. Thomas points out that Locke even collected these accounts, poring over works like Richard Hakluyt's Principal Navigations or Jean de Lery's History of a Voyage. Voyage. Now I end up seeing everything in French. Voyage to the land of Brazil. Brazil. He wasn't just a passive reader, he cross referenced them, debated their reliability, and used them to challenge dogmatic assumptions. This wasn't abstract navel gazing. Locke's ideas about the mind influence his political writings, like the two treatises of government, where he argues for liberty and governance based on consent, concepts partly informed by observing by travelogues how authority worked elsewhere. Thomas uses this to illustrate her broader point. Travel, even vicariously, has long been a catalyst for big ideas. For Locke, it wasn't. So, what's the big idea? He argues for liberty and governance based on consent. Liberty and governance based on consent, concepts partly informed by observing how authority works elsewhere. Interesting. So that means that argues for liberty and governance based on consent. Interesting. For Locke, it wasn't the physical act of moving, but the exposure to otherness that fueled his rethinking of human nature and society. It's a neat twist. Locke never set foot in Brazil or Japan, yet their echoes in print helped birth modern empiricism. Thomas leverages this to show travel's philosophical punch isn't limited to those who pack a suitcase. It's about wrestling with the unfamiliar wherever you find it. Interesting. I'm curious about this. How Pacific Islanders navigated vast oceans. Pacific Islanders' navigation of vast oceans is one of the most remarkable feats of human ingenuity, relying on a sophisticated blend of observation, memory, and skill rather than instruments like compass or maps. This tradition, often called wayfinding, allowed Polynesians, Micronesians, and other oceanic people to traverse thousands of miles across the Pacific, settling islands from Hawaii to New Zealand to Easter Island long before European explorers set sail. Here's how they did it. At the core of the method was an acute reading of the natural world. Navigators trained from youth in oral traditions memorized. Wow. At the core of the method was an acute reading of the natural world. Navigators trained from youth in oral traditions memorized star path sequences of rising and setting stars that formed a celestial compass. For example, they would track a star like Sirius rising in the east and align their canoe to follow it, switching to another as it set. This wasn't just a static map, they adjusted for seasonal shifts in latitude, knowing which stars pointed towards specific islands. The Hawaiian star compass, developed by navigators like Nainoa Thompson of the Polynesian Voyaging Society, divides the horizon into 32 houses, each tied to a star, wind, or swell direction. A mental framework passed down generations, but stars were only part of it. By day or under clouds, they read the sun's arc, its rising and setting point shifting with the seasons, and the ocean itself. Swells, the long waves generated by distant weather, were key. Navigators felt these through the canoe's hull, distinguishing steady trade wind swells from those rebounding off islands hundreds of miles away. A technique called wave piloting, still practiced in places like Marshall Islands, uses interference patterns like swells bending around an atoll to detect land beyond the horizon. Wow. Matthew Finders, an European explorer, marveled at this in the 1800s, noting islanders could sense islands 30 to 40 miles off by wave quirks alone. Birds were another clue. Species like the white tern or noddy fly out to sea daily but return to land at dusk. Spotting their flight direction at sunrise and sunset could guide a canoe to an island. Seabird guano on clouds, reflecting white from droppings below hinted at unseen atolls. Even floating debris like coconut husk or branches signaled currents flowing from land. Wind and weather rounded out their toolkit. Navigators knew prevailing trade winds, easterlies in the tropics, and could smell land, damp earth, or vegetation carried on breezes. In the Carolines, they used stick charts, not maps, but teaching tools made of shells and twigs to show swell patterns and island positions, though these were memorized, not carried aboard. The real map lived in their heads, a dynamic mix of cues recalibrated with every voyage. This wasn't guesswork, it was precise. The Polynesian Triangle, spanning Hawaii, New Zealand, and Easter Island, covers over 10 million square miles, settled between 1200 BCE and 1300 CE. Voyages like the 1976 Hokul La trip, 2,500 miles from Hawaii to Tahiti, without instruments, prove its accuracy, guided by elders like Mao Pia Luke, a Micronesian master. Archaeologists like Jeffrey Urban argue this navigation enabled deliberate colonization, not random drift, with canoes carrying families, plants, taro, breadfruit, and animals. For someone like John Locke, reading about this in travelogues, early accounts from Spanish or Dutch explorers, it would be a gold mine for empiricism. It showed knowledge built from raw experience, sensory mastery over abstract tools, varying widely from European norms, yet achieving the same end, crossing oceans. Thomas flags this as a philosophical spark. Pacific wayfinding challenges assumptions about universal season, showing how environment shapes understanding. Pretty mind blowing. Wow, that is beautiful. That is beautiful. So Socrates wasn't a traveler himself, so we don't want to look at Socrates. But travel alone doesn't cure a restless mind. You must change the mind, not the climate. Yet acknowledge that it could inspire reflection, detachment from material comforts, aligning with Stoic individuals of self mastery. It could inspire reflection, detachment from material comforts, aligning with Stoic ideals of self mastery and resilience. Strengthens one's equ- equanimity. Quotes by Plato on travel. Since he didn't pen a top 10 travel tips, imagine Plato being like, top 10 travel tips. Here's how you do it. Here's my YouTube channel. Subscribe. Below are either direct lines that touch on travel related themes or interpretations scholars connect to the concept. The soul takes flight to the world that is invisible, but there arriving, she is sure of bliss and forever dwells in paradise. But the soul's journey after death, a metaphorical trip to the realm of forms. Scholars like Emily Thomas might link it to travel by analogy, just as the soul seeks truth beyond the body. Physical travel could push us beyond the familiar to grasp higher realities. Plato's focus on leaving the cave echoes this travel as a break from shadows to flight. The soul takes flight to the world that is invisible, but there arriving, she is sure of bliss and forever dwells in paradise. We shall not be content to stay at home like children, but we shall go abroad and see the world. We shall not be content to stay at home like children, but we shall go abroad and see the world. This isn't a direct Plato quote, it's a loose paraphrase scholars attribute to his spirit, especially from the Republic, where Socrates discusses philosophers exploring beyond their city to understand justice. Plato implies the ideal ruler must know more than their own polis, suggesting travel or at least exposure to other systems refines wisdom. It's more a vibe than verbatim. The life which is unexamined is not worth living. Not about travel explicitly, but it's a fan favorite for tying to the theme. Socrates via Plato pushes for questioning everything. Travel fits here as a practical way to test your assumptions. Seeing Sparta or Egypt could shake an Athenian's worldview, making life examined. Seeing Sparta or Egypt could shake an Athenian's worldview, making life examined. Philosophers like Montaigne later ran with this, but Plato plants the seed. The philosopher's soul must ascend from this world to the contemplation of the divine. Again, this is the soul's upward travel to truth, not a literal road trip. In the Republic, Plato has Socrates describe philosophers escaping the sensory world, the cave for the intelligible one. Physical travel could mirror this ascent, leaving Athens for say Sicily, where Plato did go, might expose you to new ideas, pushing you toward the forms. He who would be a great soul in the future must study the past and the present and not be confined to one place. He who would be a great soul in the future must study the past and the present and not be confined to one place. This isn't a direct quote either, it's a synthesis of ideas from Laws and Timaeus, where Plato nods to learning from other cultures, histories, and laws. He suggests the Athenian stranger and other benefit from understanding beyond their borders, hinting travel could broaden the soul's scope. Travel could broaden the soul's scope. That's very interesting. That is very interesting. Plato's one documented trip to Sicily around 387 BC shaped his views. He visited the court of Dionysius I to test his political ideas, only to find tyranny instead of philosopher kings. Diogenes says it soured him on practical politics but enriched his dialogues. No snappy travel quotes came from it though, just the seventh letter where he reflects on seeking wisdom abroad. I went to Italy and Sicily to observe the life there. Wow. We know Montaigne said some interesting things, it seems like. Quotes by Montaigne on travel. By the way, this quote is really cool. He who would be a great soul in the future must study the past and the present, not be confined to one place. Must study the past and the present and not be confined to one place. Michel de Montaigne, the 16th century French essayist, was a big fan of travel, seeing it as a way to sharpen the mind, humble the ego, and escape the narrowness of staying put. Unlike Plato, he actually hit the road. Unlike Plato, he actually hit the road. His travel journal, published posthumously, chronicles a 17-month trip through Germany, Switzerland, and Italy. His essays weave in reflections on travel's value, often with a personal, down-to-earth tone. Here are some direct quotes from Montaigne on travel, pulled from standard translations like Donald Frames with a bit of context. Traveling through the world produces a marvelous clarity in the judgment of men. We are all of us confined and enclosed within ourselves and see no farther than the end of our nose. Wow. We see no farther than the end of our nose. This great world is a mirror where we must see ourselves in order to know ourselves. This great world is a mirror where we must see ourselves in order to know ourselves. Montaigne is riffing here on how travel smashes self-absorption. Stuck at home, you are blind to your own quirks. Abroad, you spot them reflected in others' differences. He loved how rubbing shoulders with strangers forced him to rethink his assumptions. I know well that I'm fleeing from, but not what I'm in search of. I know well what I am fleeing from, but not what I am in search of. This comes from the same essay where he admits travel's pull isn't always about a clear goal. He left France partly to dodge civil wars and boredom, but the journey itself, its uncertainty, was the point. It's less about the destination, more about shaking up your soul. I know well what I'm fleeing from, but not what I'm in search of. I know well what I'm fleeing from, but not what I'm in search of. This comes from the same essay where he admits travel's pull isn't always about a clear goal. He left France partly to dodge civil wars and boredom, but the journey itself, its uncertainty, was the point. It's less about the destination, more about shaking up your soul. I'm afraid that we have eyes bigger than our stomachs and more curiosity than capacity. We embrace everything, but we clasp only wind. I'm afraid that we have eyes bigger than our stomachs and more curiosity than capacity. We embrace everything, but we clasp only wind. Not strictly about travel, but tied to it, Montaigne's warning that we overestimate what we can take in, travel is included, hints at a skepticism of shallow tourism. Seeing new lands like reservoir travelogues is great, but without reflection, it's just noise. Each one calls barbarism whatever is not his own practice. For indeed it seems we have no other test of truth and reason than the example and pattern of the opinions and customs of the country we live in. Each man calls barbarism whatever is not his own practice. For indeed, it seems we have no other test of truth and reason than the example and pattern of the opinions and customs of the country we live in. Travel for Montaigne was the antidote to this. He had seen Swiss baths and Italian courts firsthand. Reading about savages in the America only reinforced it. Exposure to other ways of life via road or page shows your truth in just it's just local habit. I want to set out. I want to set out early in the morning, and I do not care where I lodge at night, so long as I keep moving. I want to set out early in the morning, and I do not care where I lodge at night, so long as I keep moving. From his trip diary, this captures his vibe, restless, open ended exploration. Montaigne wasn't chasing landmarks, he would detour to see a weird rock or chat with a farmer. Travel was about motion and surprise, not a checklist. Travel was about motion and surprise, not a checklist. I want to set out early in the morning, and I do not care where I lodge at night, so long as I keep moving. I want to set out early in the morning, and I do not care where I lodge at night, so long as I keep moving. From his trip diary, this captures his vibe, restless, open ended exploration. Montaigne wasn't chasing landmarks, he would detour to see a weird rock or chat with a farmer. Travel was about motion and surprise, not a checklist. The diversity of customs between one nation and another touches me only by the pleasure of variety. Even usage has its reason. Written while soaking in German hot springs, this shows his relish for difference. He didn't judge foreign habits, say Swiss table manners, as better or worse, just marveled at the logic. Travel taught him relativity over superiority. The diversity of customs between one nation and another touches me only by the pleasure of variety. Even usage has its reason. Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, that's the stream. I am